The day they buried Silas Maddox, the wind carried the smell of gunpowder clear across the cemetery, and Frances Maddox understood, standing there in her black dress with her two boys pressed against her skirts, that she would spend the rest of her life making sure that smell never touched her sons again. It was the spring of 1878, in the dusty stretch of Kansas prairie known as Larkspur Hollow, a town that had grown up around a creek crossing and a stubborn belief that the railroad would someday reach it. Silas Maddox had been a name men whispered in saloons from Dodge City to Abilene, a gunslinger with a reputation earned in a dozen towns and paid for, in the end, by a bullet from a man faster and younger than he was. He had died in the street outside the Larkspur Saloon on a Tuesday afternoon over a card game and a woman he had never even loved, and he had left behind a widow of 31 years and two sons, Thomas, 17, and Eli, 14, who had watched the whole thing from the boardwalk with their hearts pounding in their small chests. Frances had not screamed. She had not fainted. She had walked out into that street, past the gathering crowd, and knelt beside her husband's body, and closed his eyes with her own trembling fingers, and she had not shed a single tear until she was alone that night in the little house at the edge of town, with her sons finally asleep, their faces still pale with the shock of what they had seen. She cried then, not for Silas exactly, though she had loved him once in the early years, before the gun became more important to him than the farm they had tried to build. She cried for the years wasted, for the man who might have been a good father if he had only put down his pistol and picked up a plow, and most of all, she cried for her sons, who had spent their whole lives hearing stories of their father's speed and his nerve and his reputation, stories told with a kind of reverence that made young boys dream of growing up just like him. That could not happen. She decided it that very night, sitting alone at her kitchen table with a single candle burning low, and she decided it again the next morning when she found Thomas out behind the barn, practicing his draw with his father's old pistol, the one the undertaker had returned to her wrapped in a cloth still stained dark at the grip. "Put that down," she said, and her voice came out sharper than she intended, sharp enough that Eli, standing nearby watching his brother, flinched. Thomas did not put it down right away. He looked at her with Silas's own gray eyes, stubborn and proud, and for a moment she thought he might refuse her outright. "Pa was the fastest man in 3 counties, he said. "Everybody says so." "Your pa is dead," Frances said, and the words cut the morning air like a blade. "He is dead in the ground because there was always a man somewhere who was just a little bit faster or just a little bit luckier, and one day that man found him. That is the only thing that gun ever taught anybody, Thomas. It taught them how to die." She crossed the yard and took the pistol from his hands, and he let her, though his jaw was tight with the effort of not arguing further. She carried it inside and wrapped it in an old shirt and put it at the very bottom of her cedar chest, beneath the quilts and the linens, where she hoped her sons would forget it existed. But a boy does not forget his father easily, and Larkspur Hollow was not a town that let a woman forget easily either. In the weeks that followed, men would stop Thomas on the street and clap him on the shoulder and say things like, "Your pa was a legend, boy. Don't you let anybody tell you different." And Frances would watch her son's chest puff up with a pride that frightened her more than anything else in the world. She needed help, and she knew it, though she was slow to admit such a thing even to herself. The farm, 40 acres of hard Kansas soil that Silas had bought with gambling winnings and never once properly worked, needed a man's strength if it was ever going to feed 3 people through a winter. The bank in town, run by a narrow-faced man named Horace Prout, had already sent 2 letters reminding her of the debt still owed on the land, a debt Silas had taken out against future winnings that had never materialized before his death. And there was Elias Cobb, the biggest cattleman in the county, who had made no secret of wanting Frances's land for a new stock route to the railhead at Ellsworth, and who had sent his foreman around twice already with offers that were really threats dressed up in polite language. It was into this trouble that Aaron Granger rode, on a gray gelding, on a Sunday morning in late April, looking for nothing more than a wheel repaired at the blacksmith's, and finding instead a woman standing in her own dooryard with tears of frustration on her face, wrestling with a plow horse that did not want to be harnessed. Aaron Granger was 36 years old, a man who had spent 4 years in the war and had come out the other side of it wanting nothing more than quiet fields and honest work. He had fought at Shiloh as a young man barely out of his teens, had seen things there that had convinced him in the deepest part of his soul that there was no glory in violence, only grief dressed up in brass buttons. When the war ended, he had drifted west, first to Missouri, then finally to Kansas, where he had bought 80 acres 2 miles north of Larkspur Hollow and built a life around wheat and apple trees and a small herd of dairy cows. He was not a large man, not the kind who filled a doorway the way Silas Maddox had once done, but he had steady hands and a steadier gaze, the kind of man other men trusted instinctively, even if they could not have said exactly why. He reined in his horse at the fence line and watched for a moment, unsure whether to intrude, as Frances Maddox fought with the harness straps and the horse tossed its head and stamped, clearly as frustrated as she was. Finally, he swung down from his saddle. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat, "looks like that horse has got some opinions about being harnessed." Frances turned, startled, and wiped at her face with the back of her wrist, embarrassed to be seen in such a state by a stranger. "He does not approve of me," she said, with a small, exhausted laugh. "I do not think he approved of my husband either, but at least my husband was heavier than me and could win the argument by simple weight." "May I try?" Aaron asked. She hesitated only a moment before nodding, and stepped back to watch as he approached the horse slowly, murmuring something low, and even that she could not quite catch, running a hand along its neck before he ever touched the harness. Within a few minutes the horse stood calm and cooperative, and Frances found herself staring at the stranger with something between gratitude and astonishment. "You have a way with him," she said. "Horses just want to know you are not afraid and not angry," Aaron said. "Most trouble between a man and a horse is really trouble a man is carrying inside himself. The horse just reflects it back." He held out his hand. "Aaron Granger. I have got a place north of town, past the creek bend." Frances Maddox. She took his hand, and something about the calluses on his palm, the plain honesty of his grip, made her feel, for the first time in weeks, that she was not entirely alone in the world. "Maddox," Aaron repeated, and she saw the flicker of recognition cross his face, the way it always did when people connected her name to the man who had died in the street. She braced herself for whatever came next, the pity or the awkward silence or the questions about what Silas had really been like. Instead, Aaron simply said, "I am sorry for your loss, ma'am. Whatever came before, no family deserves to lose a father." And then, glancing toward the field beyond the house, where the ground lay dark and unturned, he added, "That's good soil out there. Shame to let it sit fallow through the planting season." "I know it," Frances said, and something in her voice must have carried the whole weight of her worry, because Aaron studied her for a long moment before he spoke again. "I have got some time this week, before my own planting gets too demanding," he said. "If you would not mind the company, I could help you get a start on it. No charge, no obligation, just neighbors helping neighbors, the way things ought to be done out here." Frances wanted to refuse out of pride, but pride was a luxury she could no longer afford, not with 2 sons to feed and a debt hanging over her land like a storm cloud that refused to break. "I would be grateful," she said quietly. "More grateful than I know how to say." That was how it began, not with fireworks or dramatic declarations, but with a plow horse and a length of harness and a quiet man who understood that sometimes the kindest thing you could offer a grieving woman was simply your time. Aaron came back the next morning, and the morning after that, and within a week he had turned 3 acres of the Maddox land into neat furrows ready for planting, working alongside Frances from dawn until the light gave out, teaching her the rhythms of the soil that Silas had never bothered to learn himself. Thomas and Eli watched from a distance at first, wary of this stranger who had inserted himself into their lives, but Aaron did not push himself upon them. He simply worked, steady and patient, and let the boys come to him in their own time. It was Eli who broke first, drawn by simple curiosity about the strange contraption Aaron had brought along, a hand-cranked seed drill he had built himself out of salvaged wagon parts and careful engineering. "What is that thing supposed to do?" Eli asked one afternoon, hovering at the edge of the field with his hands in his pockets, trying to look uninterested even as his eyes followed every movement of the machine. "Plant seeds in even rows at even depth," Aaron said without looking up from his work. "Saves your back the trouble of bending down 100 times an acre, and saves the seed too, since you are not scattering it about where the birds can find it easy. You built it yourself." "I did. Took me most of a winter to get it right." Aaron glanced up then and saw the way the boy's eyes had brightened despite himself. "You want to try it?" Eli looked back toward the house, as though checking whether his mother would object. But Frances, watching from the porch with a basket of mending in her lap, only smiled and nodded. And so Eli crossed the field and let Aaron show him how to work the crank, how to feel the rhythm of the wheels turning beneath his hands, how to watch the earth open and close around each small seed like a promise being tucked in for the night. Thomas held out longer, 3 full weeks of watching from a distance, his jaw set in the same stubborn line his father used to wear. But even he could not resist forever the pull of a man who seemed to know so much about so many practical things, who could explain the mechanics of irrigation and the chemistry of soil, and the patient logic of crop rotation, without ever once raising his voice or demanding respect he had not earned. The turning point came on a Thursday in May, when a sudden hailstorm swept down out of a clear sky and threatened to flatten the young wheat shoots that had only just begun to show green above the soil. Aaron had been at the far end of the field when the first stones began to fall, and he shouted for the boys to help him drag canvas tarpaulins over the most vulnerable rows. And Thomas, without thinking, without hesitating the way he might have if he had stopped to consider whether helping was beneath him, ran to grab the nearest edge of canvas and began hauling it into place alongside Aaron, the two of them working in a desperate, soaked, hail-battered rhythm until the worst of the storm had passed. When it was over, when the hail had stopped and the sun broke weakly through the retreating clouds, Thomas stood there dripping and breathless, looking at the canvas that had saved perhaps a 1/4 acre of his mother's crop, and something in his chest loosened that he had not even realized was clenched tight. "We saved it," he said, almost to himself, wonder in his voice. "We did," Aaron agreed, clapping a hand on the boy's shoulder. "That is a fine feeling, is it not? Better than any card game, I would wager. You grow something with your own hands, you protect it with your own hands, and at the end of it, there is food on the table that would not be there otherwise. No other man's blood spilled to get it, just sweat and patience and a bit of luck with the weather." Thomas did not answer right away, but that evening, for the first time since his father's death, Frances noticed her older son did not ask to see the pistol at the bottom of the cedar chest, and did not seem to be thinking about it at all. The weeks that followed settled into a pattern that Frances found herself treasuring more than she had expected to. Aaron came most days, sometimes bringing seedlings from his own orchard to graft onto the struggling apple trees Silas had planted years ago and never tended, sometimes bringing tools he had made or repaired himself, always bringing that same steady patience that seemed to calm not just the horses and the boys but Frances herself. They would work through the mornings, and in the heat of the afternoon they would sit together on the porch, drinking well water and talking, and Frances found herself telling Aaron things she had never said aloud to anyone, about the early years with Silas, back when he had still believed he could be a farmer and a husband and a father all at once, before the gambling debts and the reputation and the gun had swallowed him whole. "He was not always like that," she said one evening, as the sun sank low and gold over the wheat fields. "When we married, he told me he wanted a quiet life. He meant it, I think, at the time. But there is something about being good with a gun in a place like this that makes a man feel he is owed something more than quiet. Every town he rode into, someone wanted to test him, and every time he won, it became a little harder to imagine walking away. "I have known men like that," Aaron said quietly. "I fought alongside some of them in the war." There is a kind of hunger that grows in a man once he has tasted that particular sort of power, the power to end another man's life with the movement of a finger. It eats at everything else. Family, faith, peace. It eats until there is nothing left but the next fight. "Is that why you never carry a gun?" Frances asked. She had noticed it in the weeks he had been coming around, the complete absence of a holster at his hip, unusual for a man in that country, where even peaceable farmers often kept a pistol close at hand against rattlesnakes or worse. "I carry a rifle for hunting, and for coyotes that trouble the cattle," Aaron said. "But no, I do not wear a sidearm, and I have not since the war ended." I decided, standing in a field in Tennessee with more dead men around me than I could count, that I had used up whatever right I had to that kind of violence. I wanted the rest of my life to be about growing things instead of ending them. He paused, looking out over the darkening fields. "I do not judge a man for defending himself or his family, Frances. That is different. But there is a difference between defense and the kind of pride that turns a gun into an answer for every insult and every grudge. That is the thing I would not wish on any young man, least of all yours." Frances felt something warm move through her chest at the sound of her own name in his mouth, at the careful, deliberate way he had said, "least of all yours," as though her son's futures mattered to him as much as her own comfort did. She looked over at him in the fading light, at the strong, calm lines of his face, and realized with a small shock that she had begun, without quite meaning to care for this man in a way that went beyond simple gratitude. She said nothing of it that evening, nor the evening after, but the feeling did not fade. If anything, it grew, watering itself the same way the wheat did, in small quiet increments that were easy to overlook, until suddenly the whole field was green and thriving and impossible to ignore. It was Eli, of all people, who first noticed how his mother's eyes followed Aaron across the yard, how her laugh had returned in a way it had not since before his father's death. "You like him," Eli said one night, as Frances tucked the quilt around his shoulders the way she had done since he was small, though he was nearly a man now and would have been embarrassed to admit he still liked the ritual. "I like that he has been kind to us," Frances said carefully. "That is different from what you are suggesting." "Thomas thinks so too," Eli said, undeterred. "He said if you married Mr. Granger, we would never have to worry about the bank again, or about Mr. Cobb trying to take the land." Frances's chest tightened at the mention of both those troubles at once, reminders of the precariousness beneath the peaceful surface of their days. "Marriage is not something a person does to solve a debt, Eli," she said, though her voice was gentler than her words. "But I appreciate that you and your brother think well of him." "I do think well of him," Eli said, quiet and serious in the way that only a 14-year-old boy who has seen too much too young can be serious. "He never once talked about Pa's guns, not even when Thomas asked him about the war. He just talks about crops and weather and how to fix things. I like that better." Frances kissed her son's forehead and blew out the candle, but she lay awake a long while that night, thinking about the shape her life had taken, and the shape it might yet take if she allowed herself to hope for it. The trouble with Elias Cobb came to a head on a hot afternoon in June, when his foreman, a heavy-set man named Garrett Voss, rode up to the Maddox farmhouse with two other riders trailing behind him, their horses kicking up dust that hung thick in the still air. Frances came out onto the porch, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron, and felt her stomach turn to stone at the sight of them. Thomas and Eli were out in the north field with Aaron, out of earshot, and for a moment she was grateful for that, and then immediately frightened by what that same distance might mean if things turned ugly. "Mrs. Maddox," Voss said, not bothering to dismount, looking down at her from atop his horse with the particular contempt of a man who believes a widow woman has no real power to refuse him anything. "Mr. Cobb sent me to renew his offer on your land. $4 an acre, cash money, more than fair for ground this far from the railhead. He is prepared to close the deal by the end of the month. I have told Mr. Cobb 3 times already that this land is not for sale," Frances said, keeping her voice steady though her heart hammered against her ribs. "This is my son's inheritance. I do not intend to sell it out from under them." Voss's mouth twisted into something that was not quite a smile. "That is a shame, ma'am, truly it is, because Mr. Cobb has already contracted with the railroad to run a stock route straight through here, and he means to have this land one way or another. Now he would rather do it friendly, with a fair price paid and no hard feelings. But I expect you understand there are other ways it could go if it comes to that. A widow woman alone out here, with just a couple of boys for protection, that is a hard thing to hold onto, come winter, come trouble, come any manner of misfortune that might befall a place like this." The threat was unmistakable, delivered with the kind of oily politeness that made it somehow worse than an outright warning would have been. Frances felt her hands trembling and clenched them into fists at her sides to hide it. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Voss?" "I am simply pointing out the plain facts of your situation, ma'am. A woman in your position ought to think carefully about her son's safety before she goes making enemies out of powerful men." It was at that moment that Aaron came around the side of the barn, having heard the sound of unfamiliar horses and come to investigate, and Frances felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly buckled her knees. He walked toward them without hurry, without any show of aggression, but there was something in the set of his shoulders that made even Voss's horse shift uneasily beneath him. "Is there some trouble here?" Aaron asked, his voice mild, but his eyes fixed steadily on Voss. "No trouble," Voss said. "Just business between Mr. Cobb and the widow here. I do not believe this concerns you, Mr. Frances is a neighbor and a friend," Aaron said, and something about the plain, unhurried way he said the word friend made Frances's throat tighten with feeling. "Whatever business you have got with her, you can speak it plain, in the daylight, without the kind of talk about misfortune I just heard as I came around that barn. This is Kansas, not some lawless corner of the territory. There are courts here, and a sheriff in town who takes a poor view of men who threaten widows." Voss's face darkened, but he seemed to recalculate something behind his eyes, some assessment of risk that made him ease back in his saddle. "No threats were made," he said stiffly. "Only facts about the way of the world." "Then you have delivered your facts," Aaron said, "and now I expect you and your men have business elsewhere. Mrs. Maddox has already given her answer, 3 times now by her own account. I do not believe a 4th asking is going to change it." For a long moment, Voss simply stared at Aaron, weighing something, and Frances held her breath, uncertain whether the tension in the yard would break into violence, or whether it would simply dissolve into the hot afternoon air. Then, with a short, ugly laugh, Voss turned his horse and spat into the dust. "Mr. Cobb will not be pleased," he said. "You might want to consider, Mr. whether this is really your fight to be having. It became my fight the moment you rode onto this land and spoke to a lady the way you just did," Aaron said, still in that same mild, unhurried voice, and something about his calm certainty seemed to unsettle Voss more than shouting ever could have. The 3 riders wheeled their horses and rode off in a cloud of dust, and Frances found herself sagging against the porch railing, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her. "Are you all right?" Aaron asked, closing the distance between them quickly, his hand coming to rest on her arm, steady and warm. "I am now," Frances said, and found that it was true. "Thank you, Aaron. I do not know what I would have said to him if you had not come." "You would have said no again, same as you have every time," Aaron said gently. "You do not need me to be brave, Frances. You have proven that plenty already these past months, but I am glad I was here all the same. A man like Cobb does not respect a woman's word the way he ought to, and it does not sit right with me, the way his kind operate." They stood there a moment longer than was strictly necessary. his hand still on her arm, the afternoon sun slanting gold across the yard, and something passed between them in that silence that neither of them was quite ready to name aloud, though both of them felt it settle into their chests like a seed pressed into warm soil, waiting for the right season to grow. That night, after the boys were asleep, Frances sat at her kitchen table with a lantern burning low and wrote a letter to the county land office in Ellsworth, asking about her rights as a widow to hold her husband's property free of any claim, and about whatever legal protections existed against men like Cobb who sought to force sales through intimidation. She did not know if the letter would accomplish anything, but she felt, for the first time in a long while, that she was not simply waiting for trouble to arrive and hoping to survive it. She was fighting for something, in the only way she knew how, with paper and ink instead of powder and lead, and there was a fierce satisfaction in that which surprised her. The second trouble arrived less than 2 weeks later, and it wore a different face entirely, though it too traced back, in its own way, to the legacy Silas Maddox had left behind him. His name was Dutch Corrigan, and he had once been Silas's partner in a series of card games and quick-draw exhibitions that had traveled from town to town across Kansas and Nebraska in the years before Frances had married. Something had gone wrong between them, some dispute over money or pride that Frances had never fully understood, and the two men had parted ways bitterly, with Dutch swearing, according to the stories that eventually reached Frances's ears, that Silas owed him $300 from a rigged game that had never been settled. Dutch rode into Larkspur Hollow on a July afternoon with the sun beating down hard and merciless, and he did not waste time with the bank or the sheriff. He rode straight for the Maddox farm, a lean, hard-eyed man with a pistol worn low on his hip, and the particular restlessness of a man who has spent too many years living by his gun and too few years building anything that would outlast him. Frances was in the garden when she heard the horse, and she straightened up with a basket of beans in her hand to see a stranger dismounting at her fence, his eyes already moving past her toward the house, toward the field beyond it where she could see Thomas working with Aaron, too far away to have heard the approach. "You would be the widow," Dutch said, without preamble, without even the courtesy of removing his hat. "Silas Maddox's woman." "I am Frances Maddox, yes," she said, setting down the basket, her heart already sinking with a dread she could not quite name but recognized on some deep instinctive level. "May I ask your business?" "Your late husband owed me $300, Dutch said. "A debt of honor from a card game some years back. I have come to collect." "My husband is dead," Frances said, keeping her voice level with an effort. "Whatever debts he owed died with him. I have nothing to do with card games he played before I even knew him." Dutch's mouth curled into something that was not quite a smile, the same predatory expression Frances had seen on Voss's face, though harder somehow, more dangerous. "That is not how debts of honor work, ma'am. A man's debts pass to his estate. You have got land here and a house, and I expect there is furniture and stock worth something too. I am willing to be reasonable about it. $300 and I will trouble you no further." "I do not have $300, Frances said, and it was the plain, humiliating truth. Every spare coin she had went toward the bank debt, toward seed and tools, toward keeping her sons fed and clothed. "And even if I did, I would not pay a debt I never agreed to and cannot verify." Dutch's eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer, close enough that Frances had to fight the urge to retreat. "I did not ride 200 miles to be told no by a woman," he said, his voice dropping low and cold. "Perhaps I should speak instead to your sons. I understand the older one is near grown. Old enough, maybe, to understand a debt is a debt, and old enough to know what happens to men who do not pay what they owe." It was at that moment that Thomas came around the corner of the barn, drawn by some instinct that something was wrong, with Eli close behind him, and Frances felt her blood turn to ice at the sight of her sons walking straight into danger without knowing it. "Boys, go inside," she said sharply, but it was too late. Thomas had already seen the stranger's face, had already recognized, with the terrible clarity of a boy who had spent his whole childhood hearing stories, exactly who this man must be. "You are Dutch Corrigan," Thomas said, his voice unsteady but his chin lifted in a way that made Frances's heart clench with fear. "Pa talked about you, said you cheated him in Abilene." "Your pa was the one who cheated," Dutch said, his eyes fixing on Thomas with sudden interest, the interest of a predator noticing prey it had not expected to find so conveniently close. "And it seems his son has inherited his temper along with his tongue. Perhaps the boy would like to settle his father's debt himself. Prove he has got some of Silas Maddox's nerve in him." He said it lightly, almost mockingly, but there was a challenge folded into the words that Frances recognized with dawning horror, the ancient, terrible pattern of men provoking boys into proving themselves, into stepping into a violence they did not understand the true cost of. "Thomas," she said, her voice cracking with desperation, "go inside now, both of you." But Thomas did not move, and Frances watched with sick fascination as something shifted behind her son's eyes, some old inherited pride rising up in him despite everything she had tried to teach him these past months, some voice that sounded uncomfortably like his father's whispering that a Maddox did not run from a challenge, that a Maddox stood his ground no matter the cost. It was Aaron's voice that finally broke the terrible spell, calm and clear across the yard as he came striding up from the field, having seen the stranger's horse and felt the wrongness of the scene from a distance. "That is enough," Aaron said, positioning himself between Dutch and the boys with an easy, unhurried movement that nonetheless left no doubt about his intention. "Whatever quarrel you have got, mister, it is with a dead man, not with his children. I would ask you to state your business plainly and then be on your way." Dutch's eyes flicked over Aaron, taking his measure the way a gambler takes the measure of a new player at the table, noting the absence of a sidearm, the plain farmer's clothes, the calm that could easily be mistaken by a certain kind of man for weakness. "And who might you be?" Dutch asked. "The widow's new man, come to protect her honor." "I am a neighbor," Aaron said, "and I am telling you that there will be no settling of debts through violence on this land, not against a widow and not against her sons. If you have got a legitimate claim against Silas Maddox's estate, there is a courthouse in Ellsworth that handles such matters. That is the civilized way to pursue it." "I do not much care for civilized ways," Dutch said, and his hand moved almost lazily to rest near the grip of his pistol. "I care for what is owed to me. And I notice you are not wearing a gun yourself, Mr. Neighbor. That does not seem like a wise way to insert yourself into another man's business." The yard went very still. Frances felt her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone could hear it, and beside her, Eli had gone pale and silent, while Thomas stood frozen, his eyes darting between Aaron and Dutch with an expression of dawning terror at what his own pride had nearly set in motion. "I do not need a gun to tell you the truth," Aaron said, and his voice did not waver, did not rise, remained as steady and calm as it had been discussing crop rotations weeks before. "You can shoot an unarmed man if that is the kind of man you have become, Mr. Corrigan. There would be witnesses enough to see it, a widow and 2 children on their own land, and word travels fast in a county like this one. I expect a man who has to shoot farmers to collect his gambling debts would not find many more card games welcome to him after that, not in this territory nor any other. Every table from here to the Nebraska line would know your name for exactly what it is." It was a gamble of its own kind, Frances realized, watching the exchange with her breath held tight in her chest, a wager not on speed or accuracy but on reputation and consequence, on the simple fact that even a man like Dutch Corrigan had to live somewhere, had to eventually sit down at some table in some town and be dealt a hand, and could not do that if every man in the territory knew him as the coward who had murdered an unarmed farmer in front of a widow and her children. Dutch's hand hovered near his pistol for a long, taut moment, and Frances thought she might be sick with the waiting, and then, Slowly, deliberately, he let his hand drop away. "You are a clever man," Dutch said, something almost like respect entering his voice despite the tension still coiled in his shoulders. "Clever enough to know I would be a fool to shoot you here, with all these eyes watching." "I would rather be thought clever than thought dead," Aaron said, and something in the dry understatement of it seemed to ease the terrible pressure of the moment, just slightly, enough for ordinary breath to return to ordinary lungs. Dutch looked past Aaron then, to where Thomas still stood, pale and shaken, and something in his expression softened, just barely, into something that might almost have been regret. "Boy," he said, "your father was a fool who thought a fast gun made him something more than an ordinary man. It got him killed in the end, same as it gets most men like him killed, sooner or later. If you have got any sense, you will listen to whatever this farmer is trying to teach you, and you will forget every story you ever heard about how fast your father's draw was. Speed is not worth a damn thing once you are in the ground." He turned back to Frances then, some of the hardness returning to his face but tempered now, the immediate threat of violence having passed. "I will take this matter to the courthouse in Ellsworth, as your friend suggests," he said. "Though I doubt any judge will find much sympathy for a debt collector chasing down a widow woman. Perhaps it was never really about the money." He mounted his horse without another word and rode off in the direction of town, leaving behind a silence that took a long time to fill. Frances found herself shaking, all the fear she had held back during the confrontation flooding through her at once now that the danger had passed, and Aaron was there immediately, his arms coming around her without hesitation, holding her steady while she trembled against him. "You are safe," he murmured against her hair. "You are all safe. It is over." Behind them, Thomas had sunk down onto an overturned crate, his face buried in his hands, and Eli stood beside him, one hand resting awkwardly on his older brother's shoulder, both boys shaken by how close their father's legacy had come to swallowing them whole. "I almost got us all killed," Thomas said, his voice muffled and thick with unshed tears. "He was ready to shoot me, and I just stood there, saying his name like I wanted a fight. What is wrong with me?" Frances pulled away from Aaron and went to her son, kneeling in front of him the way she had when he was small, taking his face in both her hands. "There is nothing wrong with you," she said fiercely. "You have spent your whole life hearing that your father's pride and your father's gun were things to be admired. It is not your fault that some part of you believed it. But you are not your father, Thomas. You get to choose what kind of man you become, and I promise you, watching you today, I know now more than ever that you have a good heart underneath all that fear. You just need time and patience and people around you who will show you a better way." Thomas looked up at her, then past her to Aaron, who stood a few feet away, giving them space but not leaving entirely, his presence steady and reassuring even in his silence. "Will you teach me?" Thomas asked, looking at Aaron directly for the first time with something other than wariness in his eyes. Not just the farming, all of it. How to be the kind of man who does not need a gun to prove he is worth something. Aaron crossed the distance between them and knelt down as Frances had, so that he was eye level with the boy. "I will teach you everything I know," he said. "But I want you to understand something first, Thomas. The lesson is not that you should be afraid of guns, or that carrying one makes you a bad man. Plenty of good men carry guns, for hunting, for protection, for necessary things. The lesson is that a gun should never be the first answer, or the easy answer, or the answer you reach for because you are afraid people will not respect you otherwise. Real strength is patience. Real strength is building something that lasts, instead of tearing something down in a moment of pride. That is what I want to teach you, if you will let me." Thomas nodded, and something passed between the man and the boy in that moment, some unspoken agreement that went deeper than words, and Frances, watching them, felt her heart swell with a gratitude so large it nearly hurt. That night, after the boys had finally settled into an uneasy sleep, Frances walked out onto the porch to find Aaron still there, sitting on the steps, looking up at the wide spray of stars scattered across the dark Kansas sky. "Thank you," she said softly, coming to sit beside him. "For today, for all of it these past months, I do not know how I would have managed any of this without you." "You would have managed," Aaron said. "You are stronger than you know, Frances. But I am glad I did not have to find that out from a distance." He turned to look at her then, and in the moonlight his face was open in a way she had not seen before, unguarded, honest. "I have not been entirely truthful with you about my reasons for coming around so often." Her heart began to beat faster. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I did not keep coming back all these weeks simply out of neighborly duty," Aaron said, his voice a little rough now, uncertain in a way that was unfamiliar for a man usually so steady. "I kept coming back because I could not stay away. Because somewhere in these past months, watching you fight for your sons and for this land with everything you have got in you, I fell in love with you, Frances Maddox. I did not mean to. I did not think it was my place, given everything you have been through. But I cannot pretend any longer that this is only about crops and harnesses and neighborly kindness." Frances sat very still, feeling the words settle into her like rain into dry ground, feeling something in her chest that had been clenched tight for 3 long years finally begin to loosen. "I have felt it too," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "For weeks now. I did not know how to say it, or whether it was even right to feel it, so soon after Silas, with everything still so uncertain. But it is true, Aaron. I love you. I think I have loved you since that very first morning when you calmed that horse without ever raising your voice." Aaron reached over and took her hand, his fingers threading through hers, and they sat there together in the warm summer darkness, saying nothing more for a long while because nothing more needed to be said. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, and somewhere out in the fields the wheat stood tall and green in the darkness, growing toward a harvest that felt, for the first time in a long time, like it might actually belong to a future worth having. The trouble with Elia's cob was not so easily resolved as the trouble with Dutch Corrigan had been, however, and it came to its final crisis in the last week of August, when the wheat stood golden and heavy in the fields, ready for harvest, and Frances received a letter from the county land office, confirming what she had suspected but not been able to prove until that moment. The letter, addressed in careful clerk's handwriting, informed her that under the Homestead Act and subsequent territorial statutes, a widow held clear and undisputed title to land properly registered in her late husband's name, provided all filing fees and taxes remained current, and that no third party, however powerful, held any legal standing to force a sale absent the landholder's consent. Furthermore, the letter noted, there had been several documented complaints filed against Elia's cob regarding coercive practices towards smaller landholders in the county, and the land office would welcome any formal statement Frances wished to make regarding threats received from his representatives. Frances read the letter twice, sitting at her kitchen table with her hands trembling, not from fear this time but from a fierce, righteous anger that had been building in her for months. She thought of Voss's oily threats, of the fear she had carried through the summer, of every sleepless night wondering whether she would wake to find her home burned or her sons harmed by men acting on Cobb's behalf, and she decided in that moment that she was done being afraid. She rode into town that same afternoon, with Aaron beside her on his gray gelding, and went directly to the sheriff's office, a small brick building at the end of Main Street that Larkspur Hollow had built only 2 years earlier when the town had finally grown large enough to warrant its own law. Sheriff Cyrus Whitfield was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with a weathered face and tired eyes, a man who had seen enough of the wild years in Kansas to have developed a healthy respect for paperwork and legal process, as tools that could accomplish what bullets too often could not. He read Frances's letter carefully and listened without interruption as she described Voss's visit and the threats delivered on Cobb's behalf, and when she had finished, he set the letter down on his desk with a heavy sigh. I have had my suspicions about Cobb's methods for some time, he admitted. But suspicion is not evidence, and evidence is what a court requires. This letter, though, and your account of Voss's visit, that is something I can act on. I will ride out to see Cobb myself, and I will make it plain to him that intimidating widows is not a business practice this county will tolerate, not while I wear this badge. Will that be enough to stop him? Frances asked. Cobb is a proud man and a greedy one, Whitfield said, but he is not a foolish one. He wants his railroad stock route bad enough to bend the law where he can, but not so bad that he will risk a formal charge of extortion, not with witnesses and a documented complaint on file. I expect once he understands the risk outweighs the reward, he will look for another route, or another parcel of land where the owner is less determined than you have proven to be, Mrs. Maddox. The sheriff proved as good as his word. Within a week, word had spread through Larkspur Hollow that Elias Cobb had abandoned his plans for a stock route through the Maddox land, redirecting his cattle drives along an alternate path, 3 miles to the east that required a longer crossing but no confrontation with a widow who had, in the words of the town gossips, gotten the law and half the county on her side, and a fine strong farmer standing behind her besides. Frances heard the gossip with a private, satisfied smile, and felt, for the first time since Silas's death, that the land beneath her feet was truly, unquestionably hers and her son's, free of any shadow of debt or threat hanging over it. The wheat harvest that followed was the finest anyone in Larkspur Hollow could remember, a golden abundance that filled the Maddox barn to its rafters and left enough surplus, once the bank debt was finally paid in full, to purchase 2 new milk cows and a proper set of tools for the coming year. Aaron's own harvest, on his land 2 miles north, proved equally bountiful, and by the time the last of the grain had been threshed and stored, the whole community had begun to speak of Aaron Granger and Frances Maddox in the same breath, with the particular warm curiosity that small towns reserve for romances everyone can see coming long before the 2 people involved are ready to admit it publicly. It was Eli, characteristically direct in the way that only a 14-year-old boy who has grown comfortable with a new father figure can be, who finally forced the issue into the open, on a crisp October evening, as the 4 of them sat around the kitchen table finishing a supper of roasted chicken and the last of the summer's tomatoes. "When are you 2 going to get married?" Eli asked with the casual bluntness of youth, and watched with evident satisfaction as both his mother and Aaron went suddenly still, exchanging a startled glance across the table. "Eli," Frances said, mortified, "that is not an appropriate question." "Why not?" Eli pressed on, undeterred. "Everybody in town already thinks it. Thomas says so too. You look at each other the way people look at each other in the stories Mrs. Whitfield reads at church socials, and Aaron has been coming around near every single day for 6 months now, and I do not see why you should both keep pretending otherwise when Thomas and I already know." Thomas, 17 now and growing more thoughtful and steady with each passing month, nodded in quiet agreement. "We would not mind it," he said, his voice earnest in a way that made Frances's throat tighten with feeling. "I know it has not been that long since Pa died, but you have taught me more about being a good man in these 6 months, Mr. Granger, than I learned in 17 years watching my father. I would be glad to call you family, if that is what my mother wants too." Aaron looked at Frances across the table, and there was a question in his eyes that went beyond anything the boys had said, a question he had clearly been waiting for the right moment to ask, and had perhaps needed exactly this kind of push from 2 blunt, well-meaning boys to finally find his courage. "Frances," he said, reaching into his coat pocket and drawing out a small object wrapped in a plain cloth handkerchief, "I have been carrying this around for 2 weeks now, waiting for the right moment, and I do not believe there will ever be a moment more right than this one, with your sons already halfway to giving their blessing before I have even asked the question properly." He unwrapped the cloth to reveal a simple gold band, plain and unadorned, the kind of ring a careful, practical man might have saved for slowly over months of small sacrifices. And Frances felt tears spring to her eyes even before he spoke the words she had been hoping, in some quiet corner of her heart, to hear for weeks now. "I love you," Aaron said, his voice steady despite the emotion clearly moving through him. "I love the way you fight for your sons, and I love the way you have built something whole and good out of ground that once held nothing but sorrow. I would be honored, more honored than I know how to express, if you would consent to be my wife, and to let me stand beside you and these two fine boys for whatever years the Lord sees fit to give us." Frances was crying openly now, though they were tears of a joy so complete it felt almost too large for her chest to hold. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Aaron, of course, yes." Thomas and Eli whooped with the unrestrained delight of boys who had gotten exactly what they wanted, and the small kitchen filled with laughter and tears, and the particular warm chaos of a family finding its shape at last. And outside the window, the last light of the October evening faded gently over fields that stood ready, dark and rich, for another season's planting. They were married the following spring, in the small white church at the center of Larkspur Hollow, on a morning in April, almost exactly 1 year after Aaron had first calmed a stubborn plow horse in Frances's dooryard. The whole town turned out for the wedding, a testament to how thoroughly Frances and her sons had woven themselves back into the fabric of the community over the past year, and to how widely respected Aaron Granger had become in his own quiet way. Frances wore a dress of pale blue calico, simple but carefully made, sewn by her own hands over the preceding weeks with a happiness that had made the work feel like pleasure rather than labor. Thomas stood as one witness, solemn and proud in a new suit Aaron had helped him purchase in Ellsworth, and Eli stood as the other, unable to stop grinning through the entire ceremony despite his best efforts at dignity. Sheriff Whitfield attended along with his wife, and even Dutch Corrigan, who had settled in the county after all, having found honest work breaking horses for a rancher near Ellsworth, and having apparently taken Aaron's words to heart more deeply than anyone might have expected, sent along a wedding gift of a fine leather-bound Bible with a note that read simply, "For a family building something better than what came before. No hard feelings carried forward. D. Corrigan." The Reverend, a gentle, elderly man named Josiah Pratt who had buried Silas Maddox 2 years earlier, and had watched with quiet approval as Frances rebuilt her family from the ashes of that loss, spoke words about second chances and about the particular grace of a love that grows slowly, from patient tending, rather than one that flares up bright and burns out fast. Frances thought, listening to him, of wheat fields and apple orchards, of seeds planted in careful rows and tended through storm and drought until they finally bore fruit, and she thought it was a fitting comparison for what she and Aaron had built together, and what she hoped, with her whole heart, that her sons had learned to build for themselves as well. The years that followed were not without their hardships, as no life on the Kansas prairie in that era could ever be entirely free of hardship. There were droughts that tested the strength of their crops and their resolve alike, and one terrible winter in 1881, when a blizzard trapped them in the farmhouse for 11 days, and they burned through nearly all their stored wood keeping the fire alive. There was the ongoing work of building a life together, blending 2 households and 2 ways of doing things into one, and there were, inevitably, small disagreements and adjustments as Aaron settled fully into the role of husband and father, and as Thomas and Eli learned to think of him not as a helpful neighbor but as their own true father, a transition that took time and patience on everyone's part, but that occurred, eventually, with the same slow and steady certainty that had characterized everything else about their relationship. But there was joy too, abundant and constant, the particular joy of a family built deliberately and with great care rather than simply inherited by accident of birth. Aaron sold his own land 2 miles north to a young couple newly arrived from Ohio, and combined the proceeds with what remained of the Maddox debt payments to expand the farm at Larkspur Hollow to nearly 120 acres, planting new orchards alongside the wheat fields, and adding a proper irrigation system fed by the creek that ran along the property's eastern edge. A system he designed himself using knowledge gathered from journals and correspondence with agricultural experts as far away as Illinois. Thomas, true to the promise that had begun that day with the hailstorm, grew into exactly the kind of man Frances had hoped for, thoughtful and steady, with none of his father's restless hunger for reputation and violence. He courted and eventually married a young woman named Susanna Cole, the schoolteacher's daughter, in 1883, and the two of them built a small house of their own on a parcel of the Maddox land, continuing the family tradition of wheat and apples and careful, patient work. Eli, meanwhile, developed a passion for veterinary medicine, having spent so many hours alongside Aaron tending sick livestock and injured horses that the calling seemed to find him rather than the other way around. And by 1885, he had traveled to Kansas City to study formally with a veterinary surgeon there, returning eventually to serve the entire county with a skill and gentleness that made him beloved wherever he went. Neither boy, in all the years that followed, ever wore a gun for anything beyond the ordinary necessities of hunting and protection against wild animals, and neither ever raised a hand in violence against another man, a fact that Frances noted with quiet, private pride every single year on the anniversary of Silas's death, when she would walk out to the small cemetery at the edge of town and stand for a while at her first husband's grave, not with bitterness, but with a kind of sorrowful gratitude for the lesson his life and death had taught her, a lesson she had managed, against all odds, to turn into something good for the sons he had left behind. Frances and Aaron had 2 children of their own together in the years following their marriage, and it was perhaps fitting, given everything that had come before, that the first of these children, born in the winter of 1880, was a boy, whom they named Wyatt after no one in particular, simply because Frances had always liked the sound of it, strong and plain and honest, much like the man who had become his father. Wyatt grew up surrounded by the particular abundance of a large, loving family, with 2 older half-brothers who doted on him shamelessly and taught him to fish in the creek and ride his first pony almost before he could properly walk. 2 years later, in the autumn of 1882, Frances gave birth to a daughter, whom they named Hope, a name that felt to both her parents like the truest and simplest description of everything their marriage represented. A hope that had grown slowly out of grief and hardship into something rich and lasting, the way wheat grows out of dark, turned soil, the way an apple tree, patiently grafted and tended, eventually bears fruit sweet enough to make a person forget the bitterness of the years before. Frances Granger, as she now called herself, though the old-timers in Larkspur Hollow sometimes still slipped and called her Mrs. Maddox out of long habit, would sit some evenings on the porch of the farmhouse that had grown so much larger and warmer than the lonely place she had stood in on the day of Silas's funeral, watching her children and grandchildren, in later years, playing in the yard where a hailstorm had once threatened everything she had, and she would think about the strange and winding path that had led her here, from a widow's grief to a wife's contentment, from a fear that her sons would inherit their father's violence to a quiet certainty that they had inherited instead something far more valuable, a patient understanding of what it truly meant to build a life worth living. Aaron would often come out to join her on those evenings, settling beside her on the porch swing he had built the second spring of their marriage, taking her hand in his the same steady, sure way he had taken it that first night beneath the wide Kansas stars, and they would sit together in a comfortable silence that needed no words, watching the sun go down gold and orange over fields that had once stood fallow and now stood forever green with growing things. Wheat and apples and children and a love that had been planted carefully, tended patiently, and allowed at last, after so much sorrow, to grow into something that would outlast them both, passed down through sons and daughters and grandchildren yet unborn, a legacy not of the gun, but of the plow, not of speed and pride and violence, but of patience and kindness, and the deep, abiding faith that the best things in this life, like the best crops in any field, are the ones a person has the courage to plant and the devotion to tend through every storm that comes. In the town of Larkspur Hollow, in the years that followed, when old-timers told stories on winter evenings about the gunslinger Silas Maddox and the woman he had left behind, they no longer told the story as one of tragedy and loss alone. They told it instead as the story of Frances Maddox, the widow who had refused to let her sons inherit their father's violence, who had found, in a quiet, steady farmer named Aaron Granger, not just a husband but a partner in the slow and sacred work of building something that would last, and who had taught an entire community, through the simple example of her own life, that the truest strength a person could possess was not the speed of a draw, but the patience to plant, and the courage to keep planting, no matter how hard the ground, no matter how uncertain the harvest, until at last, against all the odds that a hard and unforgiving frontier could throw against a person, something beautiful and lasting finally grew. And on quiet evenings, long after the children had grown and started families of their own, long after the wheat fields had been passed down to Thomas and his own sons, and the veterinary practice had spread Eli's gentle reputation across 3 counties, Frances would sometimes catch Aaron's eye across the supper table, and something would pass between them, wordless and warm, the same understanding that had first bloomed between them over a stubborn plow horse so many years before. A recognition that whatever else life had taken from them, whatever griefs and hardships had shaped the long road to this particular evening, they had found in each other exactly the kind of steady, patient, abundant love that a person spends a whole lifetime hoping to plant, and are fortunate, truly fortunate, ever to see bloom.